Welcome. Our question this time is, does fine-tuning of the universe give us evidence that God exists? Now, if you're not familiar with the term fine-tuning, what that means is that within the universe there are certain constants that we are aware of scientifically that are tuned to a certain value. So, for example, the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second is the speed of light. Scientists are reliant on some of those being consistent, and the universe is also reliant on those variables being right on the number they are on. There's about 20 of them, and if you were to turn any of them up a little bit or down a little bit, the whole universe as we know it would fall apart. And why is that significant? Because the chances of that happening by accident are astronomically low. And so let's look at some numbers here. So you ever do that penny thing? I don't have a penny with me, but if you take a penny and you double it every day for a month, you would get $1 million. Or you could look at it this way. Now, I'm not saying anybody's betting here, but let's say someone said, you know what? Your chances of winning $100 were 1 in 100. Okay, that's not bad. Well, what if they said your chances of winning were 1 in a million? You'd say that's not great. 1 in a billion? You would say, I'll never win. Okay. And there's only 7 or 8 billion people on the earth. So if anyone ever gave you those odds in anything, you wouldn't take them because it would just be so far-fetched. I'm just trying to get some figures in our minds of how much these numbers are. Now, when it comes to a trillion, I remember once reading what $1 trillion was. And so imagine you had a stack of quarters and you stacked them up. You know, how many would you have if you went as tall as a house? Thousands? What if you went as high as the atmosphere in the earth? You might be into millions. Well, if you kept stacking them and you stacked them far enough to reach the earth to the sun, that would be 1 trillion quarters. So it's just some really extremely high number that's almost beyond our ability to fathom. But that's just $1 million, okay, or 1 million quarters. Again, just trying to get you familiar with some numbers that are within our realm of believability. Now, why is that important? Because when it comes to fine-tuning of these different variables, like the speed of light, the Planck's constant, the weak, strong forces of energy, and there's more. The possibility of all of them being at that exact number that they are in order to have life in the universe is way more than 1 trillion times 1 trillion to 1 that it happened by accident. And yet we only have one universe. It was only happened once. So what are the chances that that could have been by accident? And I would say it didn't happen by accident. You know, you just look at those numbers and you can't explain them away. Now, I've heard somebody say, well, that's just the way it is. Now, it's odd that a scientist that will use all science their whole life, and then when they get to an answer they can't answer, they say, well, they abandon science and go to blind faith, and they just don't want to believe it. Right now, there isn't really a good answer other than that, yeah, it was designed by purpose. It was designed intentionally that way. And so if we believe in God, it makes perfect sense because God is intelligent. He was all intelligent being, all powerful, And so when he created the universe, he created it with purpose. And he knew that he was going to be creating life within the universe. And so when he created it, he created all the variables that were necessary to be finely tuned to exactly what they are so that they could form life within the universe and do it in one chance, like one creation event. And so it makes perfect sense when we believe in God that it was designed that way. One time it happened and we have life, and we're here today to prove it. Whereas if you don't have intelligence at the beginning and it's just random events, what's the chances of our universe happening in one chance out of a trillion times a trillion and more? See, it just doesn't make sense. So that's just another indication that God exists, and we're using reasonable facts and things that we are aware of to explain it. Hello, welcome back. All right, our question this time is a tough one. Why does God allow evil? Well, before we answer that, I guess whatever you believe, you're going to have to answer the same question. Why does some other belief allow evil? So for example, if someone believed that the universe was always there and the universe has no intelligence, then why did it allow evil? In the Christian belief of God, there is an answer, and we are going to answer that in the next few minutes here. But I do want to go back and look at ancient Greek belief of multiple gods. So even back then, Socrates was starting to ask some serious questions. And one of them was, well, if a God is all-powerful and all-knowing and doesn't have a beginning or end, then how can there be multiple gods? Because eventually one would have to be first. And so he was starting to see holes in the belief of polytheism at that point in time. And then over the next several hundred years, the idea of multiple gods started falling apart, and the common person starting to see through it. If you have an all-powerful and all-knowing God, then there can only be one. So how does that help us answer this question? Why does God allow evil? Well, one thing it helps us with is that evil is much lower than God. So the goodness of God is much more powerful than evil. And we'll see that in a few minutes here. But a lot of people worry about all the evil in the world. Well, we do have to ask, do we believe there's evil in the world? And the answer is definitely yes. And if someone doesn't believe that, you just have to take a look around and see on the regular media news, you can just see all kinds of violence without reason. I mean, even when you see someone attack someone who's innocent for no reason whatsoever, I mean, there's really no other way to explain it except there is evil. If something ever happened to someone in your family, that someone did something wrong against them or against you, then all of a sudden you'll realize that there is evil and there is wrong in the world. And how do we explain it is the question here. So here's the Christian belief, and it does make sense, and then you can ask it about other religions as well. So God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and he has the ability to create. And so he creates the universe, which is a created entity. He's more than the universe. So he just creates the universe, and within that he creates other beings or other creatures, other materials. So if we start with, we have rocks, and then we have plant life, we have fish and other things, and then he gets to a decision where, okay, should I make intelligent life? And so up to this point, there is no evil because there's no intelligent life yet. So you can see that here's God, and then you have the universe, and then you even have created things in it, and evil does not exist yet. So what's the one thing about evil that needs to exist first in order for there to be evil? And the answer is there has to be intelligent life with free will. If God decided that he wanted to make a bunch of robots that were intelligent but had no ability to make decisions on their own, then yeah, there might be some intelligence, but there wouldn't be any evil yet. But then you'd argue, well, then they're kind of like slaves too, because they don't have any choice and they're being told what to do. Now, when we look at God created beings that are intelligent, by giving us free will, what does that really mean? It really means that we can decide on our own, follow what God says and all the good things that he says, or we can choose on our own and do things without God. And so in Christian terminology, that would be called sin. If we go against God and on our own pride, we decide what to do outside of God, then that can lead us into sin, and then sin leads to evil. So when we believe in God, he tells us all the good things and right things to do. So if we follow God, there would never be any evil in the world. So if anybody says that God invented evil, that would be wrong too, because he is all good, and if we do what he said we should do, we would always be good and never sin and never turn to evil. So God didn't create evil, but he allowed free will. And then one of those possibilities of free will is that we can turn away from God and choose things that are bad for us, hurt other people, and that's what we call evil. So why does he allow it? Basically, it's to allow free will. And then we have a choice. Now there's a big benefit of free will too, is that, hey, we are living beings, and it's an honor or a blessing to really have the ability to think and choose and make choices in our lives. Some really beautiful things that we can choose for good and love other people, do good for other people. That's something that no other being can do. You know, we can choose, and we're in the world, and we can work and create things and do things and help other people. So it's really a good thing that we have the ability to have free will. And one of those choices that we have is to follow God. And if we follow God, we can benefit and do good things. Now, getting back to the point where some people feel overwhelmed, that they think evil and goodness are always here, like equal, or sometimes evil is higher. But that's not it at all. It's more like this. This is good and this is evil here. And what happens is a lot of people will get caught up today. If you look at some news programs, every single night there's something about violence and evil and killing or murders every single night. So if someone watches that all the time, eventually they can believe that, yes, evil is up here and good is here. But really, if you just, in your ordinary life, how many times does something evil happen, and how many times does something good happen, or just what we consider normal? Normal life is usually really good. So goodness is much higher than evil. And even in the world, I think there's more good than evil. I think most people want to do good. They want to help people, help their families. Being open to God would be good too. In the whole scheme of things, God created everything. And then you have the universe, and then you have created beings, and within some created beings, they can choose evil. So evil is really small, And then all we have to do is if we ever encounter evil, we can always call upon God for help. And so he is much more higher than evil. So always call upon God for help. And so why does he allow it? Free will. And we will get to in the future when it comes to how he's going to face sin and help repair sin. We can see how God can allow evil and then later bring good out of it. So he's the only one. He can take something evil and still bring good out of it, which sometimes aggravates the devil because he wants things to always stay bad. But God can bring goodness out of things that we're not even aware can happen. And so that just shows that he's always more powerful than evil, that no matter what evil comes along, God can keep renewing and bringing good things into the world. So I know that's a really difficult question, and it may not make you feel any better because there is evil in the world and it does have consequences. It does hurt us a lot at times. And so we're not trying to explain that God makes every single thing feel good, but we're just explaining why God allows evil and then how the Christian belief can explain it where some others may not be able to. Hi, it's fall and it's time to look at our compost pile. Now there isn't much time left, so we are going to do a cold compost pile instead of a hot one. What's the difference? A cold compost pile, inside the temperature is not really going to be any different or much different than the outside temperature. And that's okay. It's very difficult to get your compost pile to be hot enough to kill everything. So what we're going to do is we're not going to worry about that. One way to start out is we're not going to put any weeds, seeds, or disease in our compost pile, just to be safe. When you create a compost pile, you use whatever you have. In my case, I have a lot of leaves and a lot of grass. So as I was cleaning up leaves as they were falling and I was mowing the final grass for the season, I was chopping them both up with my lawnmower and putting them together. And the reason why I do that is because your compost, you want a mix of greens and browns. Greens have nitrogen, the browns have carbon, and you also have other nutrients and minerals mixed in there. As long as you don't go crazy with the green, you should be okay. So for example, you don't want to create a large pile of solid green grass because then that will turn anaerobic. It won't have enough oxygen. It'll start smelling and it'll turn into mush. So having a healthy amount of brown mixed in with the green is going to keep it aerobic, has enough oxygen in it, and it'll break down better. It should smell like forest or leaves. It shouldn't have a bad odor to it. If it does have a bad odor to it, that means you need to add more brown in it. So let's go through the different things you can put into your compost pile. Like I mentioned, leaves. Now leaves by themselves can take 2 or more years to break down if you had a large pile. So what we do is we run over them with our lawnmower several times to start getting them into smaller pieces. Now that could cut down the compost time in half or more. So just to kind of get it started. We also put in grass. If you have too much green grass, then what you can do is, if you have extra space, lay that out flat on the ground and let it turn brown. You can then re-add that brown grass into your pile later without it going anaerobic on you. Some other things you can add are coffee grinds. In my case, if I went through a tin or two of coffee grinds over the winter, I could sprinkle them on there and I have no problem with that. Food scraps. Now in my compost pile, I don't put any food scraps in it, simply because I have enough materials not to. And also, be mindful of your neighbors, and you don't want to cause a smell. If you put in too many food scraps and it's got a bad odor to it, then you need to put in more brown layers usually. If you're going to put in vegetables in it, cover them when you're done with leaves or something else so that you shouldn't be able to smell it standing there. In my case, I don't even add them at all, and I don't have that problem. The end result is your compost pile should smell nice, like a forest or a nice earthy smell to it. So you can also add in cardboard if you're breaking up small hand-sized pieces. Now, unless you're saving your cardboard for your lasagna garden like we did in our last episode, you can then break it up into small pieces and use that as your brown layer. If you have wood chips, you can add them, but here's a key difference. If you're going to put your compost on top of the soil and not mix it in, then it's okay to add wood chips. If you're going to be mixing your compost into your soil, then don't add wood chips. Because if they're not broken down yet, when they're in the soil and they start decomposing there, they're going to be robbing your plants of nitrogen while they're doing that. So that's the key thing, is don't put wood chips in your compost unless it's going to be acting as a mulch layer. So what I do is, just to be safe, is if I have a pile of wood chips, I'll just keep them separate and let them break down on their own. And then in the spring, I can decide how to use them. I have the choice at that point. In my garden, I'm actually using almost all of my compost as a mulch because I don't think I'm going to be able to get it all broken down by the spring. That's like the safest way to do compost, because then whether it's 10% broken down or 50% or 80%, it's all going to be good. Because our number one thing is we want to block out weeds. And so having enough mulch to cover your soil with 4 or 5 inches of material, that's my main goal. So I don't care if my compost is fully broken down or not. It's going to be totally on top of the soil. And I think that's one of the easiest compost piles to start. If you want to get it all the way broken down, it's going to take a little bit longer, or you may have to look into a hot compost. So some other things you can add are wood ash. I have a wood stove, so during the winter I'm going to have to clean out the ash. So instead of buying lime and sprinkling it over my garden in the fall, I can just use wood ash and sprinkle that over the garden, or I can add a bucket into my compost piles. And the wood ash, what's that going to do is usually it will add potassium. It's more on the alkaline side, where leaves can be more on the acidic side. So if I add those both, they'll balance out each other. So with compost, if we're around a pH of 7, give or take a little bit, that's fine. Another thing that people are considering adding to their compost piles is biochar or charcoal. I would say the key to think about with biochar is think of it as like mini sponges. You don't want to put raw biochar into your soil directly, because think of it as a filter. Like, that's why we have them on water filters. They absorb all the nutrients. We don't want to put that directly in the soil where they're going to be doing that at the same time the plants want the nutrients. So what we want to do is put the biochar charcoal in our compost as early as possible. That way it has time to soak up as many of those nutrients as possible. And then when we put it into the garden in the spring, we're going to have more nutrients available to the soil. So one of the things I get asked is like, what size should I make my compost pile? Since ours is a cold compost pile, we don't care about the size. If you're looking to get a warm or hot compost pile, you want to have at least a 3 foot by 3 foot pile. Since we're doing a cold compost pile, the size really doesn't matter. Just keep adding your materials to it. Now, if you're making a compost pile that you want to be fully broken down by the time you use it in your garden, then you have to think of it as in terms of batches. So you're going to get all your ingredients all piled up in a short amount of time, and then you want them all to compost or decompose together. In that situation, you don't want to keep adding more and more and more ingredients, because when the older ones are done, you're going to have new ones in there that are just starting. Now, with a cold compost pile where we're not really concerned about breaking down and we're just going to be using it as a mulch, I would say you can keep adding to it. Like in this case here, I've got mostly grass and leaves, so I can just keep adding more and more to it, and I'm not too worried about it. It's great if at the bottom in the spring I've got some finished compost, but for the most part I just want to make sure I have enough material for mulch and blocking out weeds that I can decompose over time. So there you go. Just take whatever you have, start a pile, get it going. Any compost is better than none. If you have some finished compost by the spring, great, your plants will love it. If you don't, and it's not decomposed at all, then you can still use it as a mulch. And that's what I do. No matter what, your compost can help your garden. So try it out. Remember to enjoy your time outside with God in your garden. God bless. Thank you for joining us this time, and here is a bonus reflection for you.